Hey everyone, welcome to the EverydayFI podcast, the show that explores the lives and stories of everyday people in the financial independence community. Today I'm going to be talking with Doug, and many of you might recognize his voice. He and his daughter wrote a book together about raising FI-minded children, and we do talk about that a little bit today, but mainly we talk about Doug's story. We talk a lot about him being in the military, him retiring early in his 40s, and basically surfing for the rest of his life after that, even though people said, "What are you going to do, surf all day?" He said, "Yes, I am." Also, Doug and I talked for so long that we actually recorded almost 2 hours worth of audio. So this is part one of 2 episodes. Tune into our conversation right after this. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me on EverydayFI again. I love that you guys are all here. This is so exciting. I'm almost at 6 months of the podcast, which is super cool. And I love that you guys are all still listening. Keep going because I've got some really great guests lined up. For example, I have Doug here with me. Hey, Doug, how are you doing? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, Megan. I'm Doug Nordman, and thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed your episode with Carl and Carla, and I'm looking forward to a good talk about personal finance. I'm coming from Oahu in Hawaii, and I've lived out here for 35 years now since the Navy brought my spouse and myself here in 1989. And we retired here. I retired from active duty in 2002. I was in the U.S. Navy's submarine force, and my spouse was in meteorology and oceanography. But we realized that we liked Hawaii better than any other places we'd ever been stationed in the world before then, and we wanted to stay here. Of course, we were also at the time raising our family. After I retired from active duty, our daughter was 9.5 years old. We refer to that period of her life as the danger years. And we were glad to have full time and full presence in her life and be around for her for the whole time she was finishing growing up. I'm not sure she appreciated that at the time, but now that she's married and she's a parent, they're raising our 4-year-old granddaughter. They are back on Oahu. He's still on active duty in the Navy. She's finished her Navy commitment. But now that they're raising another tropical cyclone version of a kid, they really appreciate that we were involved in her life when we were raising her. But I joke that I start every day with a surf forecast. Retirement is wonderful life, especially when you're financially independent and have control of your time, your way. And I've been writing about this for military families as well as families raising their money savvy kids. Now that I'm getting older, I'm starting to write for an older crowd that's also approaching Medicare, Social Security, those kinds of questions.
That is incredible. There's a lot there. First of all, Hawaii. Wow. I feel like that's a lot of people's dreams to live out there for 35 years. Okay. You have to explain to me what you mean by danger years, because I'm not a parent yet, and I feel like I need to be prepared for something. So what are the
Well,
danger years? What do you mean by that?
the danger years are when it's okay, probably they're old enough that you can leave them alone in the house for a half an hour or maybe even an hour. Age of 9, maybe it's okay for them to be a latchkey kid, come home from school and let themselves into the house. On the other hand, as they get older, the teenage years start about the time they're 10. And as they get older and more independent, they come up with more ideas that really seem like a good idea at the time that we parents probably wouldn't approve of if we were there. And I also felt pretty strongly that when I was retiring at that age for her, that she was still interested in talking to us, right? We were still fun to be around and still cool at age 9.5. That was not the situation at all when she was 13 or 14. Now, they still want you in their lives at that age, but mostly at that point, they just want money and transportation. They don't want to be seen with you in public. That's embarrassing, but they still know that you're there to support them. And that's what's really important.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I can prepare myself for that. And also, I feel like 10 years old is so young to be starting your teen years. I'm trying to think back and I'm like, was I a teenager when I was 10? I don't know. I definitely started caring more about what I was wearing at that age. So maybe that was the start of it. So
It doesn't have anything to do with maturity. It's just an attitude. And there will be no doubt in your mind when you encounter a teenager, even if they're only 9 or 10 years old.
yeah, that's fair. And my parents are like, "Oh, we really hope we're still alive when you have a teenager," because apparently I was a terror. And I was one of those that dyed their hair purple,
Right,
snuck
right.
out of the house, stuff like that. So I turned out okay, though. I feel like.
Of course,
I'm
I was
okay.
never like that. When I was a teenager, I was a perfect role model. But when my
I
daughter
feel like you're
apologizes,
lying.
maybe I'm exaggerating the truth a tiny bit. Statute of limitations expired long ago. But I never get tired of hearing our daughter or son-in-law apologize to us for the way they were when they were being raised. And my son-in-law is apologizing, even though I didn't know him until he married her. And he's still apologizing for his daughter's behavior.
That's so funny. Oh, I can't wait. Great. Well, thank you for explaining that to me because, like I said, I don't have kids yet, so I don't know what that means. So you guys sound like you were an entirely military family. How did you get into the Navy yourself? And then it also sounds like your daughter and her husband were also in the Navy. How did they get into it? Is it because they saw how great it was for you? I'd like for you to talk through that military aspect of your life a little bit.
I tell people that I'm not a member of the recruiting agencies or a member of the retention team. But when I was an impressionable young teenager in high school, I had a best friend, and his older brother was a midshipman at the Naval Academy. And gosh, he made it look good. In retrospect, every time I saw his older brother was home on leave, had a 3 or 4 day beard, had Wednesday morning, he was hanging around the house, had a beer in one hand, and he was going out on dates every night. It looked pretty attractive from the perspective of a 14-year-old. And then when I got there, I found out it was slightly different than the advertising. And when I got there, I was also fairly stubborn and persistent. And that was exactly the structure and discipline. Today, I appreciate that it was what I needed at those years. If I'd gone to a normal college, something other than a service academy, I probably would have partied my way out of there by Thanksgiving. So it was beneficial in the end. It gave me the structure and discipline I needed and showed me how to set goals and reach them, even if it wasn't my idea at the time. But later on, that helped in life. I met my spouse there. She did her time in the Navy as well. She did almost 20 years in oceanography and meteorology. And then she moved to the Navy Reserve a little bit short of 20 and did another 6 or 7 years in the reserves before she retired. So the two of us met there. We got married 4 years after we graduated. We did distance until we could get stationed together. One of the reasons that we came out to Hawaii was because at the time it was the nation's largest submarine home port for me. There were plenty of jobs there for her, for oceanography and meteorology. And it's not all blue whales and flipper. This is military oceanography where you're doing sonar equations and forecasting flight weather for aircraft to go out and find submarines. So it was fairly busy, fairly intense. But once we got things under control in our lives and we'd been on active duty, I think, for about 10 years, I remember we were just about finished with my second sea duty tour. And we decided, well, I'm coming to shore duty. Maybe we should try starting a family. And maybe that would work. And actually, it happened very quickly in retrospect. By that point, we were raising our daughter while we were on active duty. And she saw the things that go on in the Navy. And admittedly, there's a lot of cool gear. And I probably made it look pretty good. And her mother's a role model of women in the military. So she probably heard all the good sea stories and ignored all the bad sea stories. And that's how she ended up joining herself. She did Navy ROTC in her university, got her degree in civil engineering and did 5 years of active duty. But we joke, she's a smart one, that she figured out 5 years was more than enough. She'd seen enough and she went into reserves. And then today she's a total civilian. She's a veteran, but she's a military spouse. Our son-in-law is still on active duty. He's had 10 years. He's probably got another 2-3 years left, but my spouse and I are financially independent. Our daughter was raised with financially independent parents, and she knew exactly what kind of lifestyle she wanted and wanted to reach financial independence as soon as she could. And she did. They're in their 30s. They're financially independent now. He does not need to stay on active duty. He might end up going to the reserves around 27, 28, somewhere in there. It depends on how much challenge and fulfillment he's having. If he's enjoying it, he'll keep doing it. If he's not having fun and he wants to do his own thing, he certainly can afford to do that.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think it's funny that everybody ignored the bad parts of being in the military.
Watch out what stories you share with your kids, because they're only listening selectively, and just make sure that you de-glamorize it as much as possible.
Oh, yes. I remember my parents telling me that I was a selective listener as well. Yeah. So I'm interested. So you said your wife was meteorology and oceanography
at the Naval Academy,
okay.
And she was studying oceanography. And one of the few communities available to women in the military and the Navy in the 1980s was actually oceanography, and involves oceanography and meteorology. The nice thing about it is that she gets sent to get a graduate degree. If you're in that field and that's your specialty, you get a graduate degree in what's called air ocean sciences, but it means both meteorology and oceanography. It's fascinating. And today she says that she's totally retired, but I still get the weather forecast to a great bit of detail, which is helpful, right, for surfing. And if we live with hurricanes out here, and if she sees something she doesn't like in the weather, we're usually about 24 hours ahead of the news cycle, and we know what we need to do. But we did that whole career dual military while dealing with being in the same home port, being able to find jobs that were reasonably close together in rotation dates. And of course, I was going on sea duty, so I would be underway, and you wanted to have her at home to take care of her daughter. It all worked out, but it is not easy. The military gives a lot of lip service to dual military couples and taking care of our people and being stationed together. But as soon as it gets tough, they say, well, really the needs of the service really are that we do it this way. And we're sorry we can't co-locate you for this one tour. So I tell dual military couples, you make it work as long as you can, but eventually one of you is probably going to end up leaving active duty for the reserves or the National Guard.
Okay. Yeah. I've never been in the military, so I know very little about it, despite my father being in the military for a stint. So thank you for explaining that. And there's probably some people in our audience who didn't know that was a thing for women in the 80s.
It's getting better every year, and it will keep getting better. I think having women in the military is wonderful. I think having more people in the military to take a 3-section duty or a 4-section watch bill is fantastic. And frankly, back in the 80s, when we were restricting what women could do in the military, I think we were depriving ourselves of the smarter group of people that could help us out.
It's something that sometimes I wonder, did I miss out on not doing that? Because my dad, when I was 18, I lived with him. My parents were divorced a long time ago, but I lived with him as a teenager. And he mentioned, like, why don't you go into the military? He's one of those people who thinks that every single person who is capable should serve their country in some way in the military. And at that time, I think you said something about you being like strong headed. You had nothing on me when I was 18. I was a little poop head as a teenager. And so I probably would have gotten kicked out like 3 weeks in for yelling at somebody, yelling back at the
Maybe.
training person. But yeah, I don't know why I didn't consider it. At the time, it was 2004, and the war in that Bush had launched us into was going on. And I'd actually seen a lot of that. And then September 11th had just happened. And so I saw like the scarier sides of what war was like. And so I think that also just kept me from it. And I wasn't somebody who was very, fit or like physically capable. And so I just didn't think that I would be able to pass training or anything like that. So
No, the military will help you with that. That takes care of itself pretty much. Once you jump into the recruit training pipeline, the physical part follows very quickly.
Really? Okay. Because I've had people tell me who were in like the Marines say women probably wouldn't be able to physically do this. So you have to carry 100-pound packs for miles and miles, and women can't do that. And I'm like, well, I don't know about that, but we just need a little bit more training. But yes. So yeah, that's good to know that it would come just for any of those women out there, because that's one thing that I hear, that women shouldn't join because they physically can't do some of the things that men can do.
There are physical requirements for some of the communities, for special warfare, for SEALs, for Army Rangers, but there are women who have passed the qualification exams for those that have gone through the training and qualified. It's not easy. It's not easy for women that are smaller and lighter, just like it's not easy for men that are smaller and lighter. However, there's also plenty of other things you can do in the military that don't involve being able to carry 100 pounds for 30 miles in 24 hours. And we joke about this is how you end up in the Air Force or the Space Force. The reality is that the Air Force and Space Force have such a tremendous quality of life compared to the other services. We're all insanely jealous of those services. But there's plenty of things to do in the Navy, plenty of things to do in the Army that do not require exceptional levels of triathlete, ultramarathon physical fitness. And you'll find your strengths when you take the diagnostic entry exams and when you talk to people. I think the military is something that you find attractive, interesting, and challenging. And that's probably a good reason to join the military. Another reason that people end up on active duty is because they feel like they're stuck in life in a bad situation or not going anywhere and feel like they're running out of alternatives. So sure, let's join the military. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. For them, it's usually a leg up and a handout from where they are in life and a chance to take a different path. So there's many reasons to join the military, but they should all be voluntary, because those of us who are serving in the military only want to serve with people who are at least willing to be there, happy is optional, but enthusiasm and commitment is what is really necessary. As long as you can stand a watch, I don't really care who you are or where you came from or what you know, but as long as you get qualified and help us do our jobs, then we're happy to see you.
Yeah, those are really great points. I just spoke to somebody named Devin. He was interviewed on Choosify around, I think, in September. And his episode for this podcast came out in October. And he's 22 in the military. I think he's at a sergeant level already because he joined when he was 17. And we were talking about this, about who should join, because he was able to get a lot of money for his school and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, should people join to get their school paid for? And he's like, when you're thinking about joining, you need to really think it through, because it is a scary thing, because people sometimes don't come home. Like, it's not, if you're trying to get your school paid for and that's the reason you're joining the military, maybe not. You really have to think this one through. This is a huge decision. It's probably up there with getting married, having kids type of deal, because it is very life-changing for some people. And I was like, that is a really good point. So I really like that you're also kind of iterating on that a little bit too in this conversation. And I have so many questions about the military. And you know what? I'm just going to ask them because, some
Go
people
right
in
ahead.
our audience might have the same questions. Okay. So my first one is, you said that there are other alternatives than just doing, I don't know all the terminology for everything, but I guess being the boots on the ground and having to carry your pack 100 miles or whatever. What are the other alternatives that some people, whether they're men or women, what alternatives can they do in the military? And is the military set up in a way that you can figure it out? If you join, say, the Navy and you're like, okay, actually, this isn't for me, I'd rather be in the Air Force. Are you able to switch easily? Kind of like college major? Like, how does that work?
If you talk to the recruiters, the answer is, of course, it's easy to switch. And the answer is, well, it's a little more complicated than that. If you join the Navy and you end up on a surface ship and you decide you really should have joined naval aviation, you may be asked to stick around for a 4 or 6 or even 8-year enlistment in the surface forces in that specialty you took at the time. And it's because money has been invested in you for training and you've advanced and you've gotten some skills and some leadership experience. But at some point, and it seems like forever, 4, 6, or 8 years, you'll have an opportunity to decide what you want to do for your next tour. And at that point, you can say, I think I've seen enough of the surface Navy. I'm reaching the end of my contract, whether you're an officer or enlisted. I'd like to do something different this time. If we re-enlist me, if I sign up for another commitment, I'd like to do it in aviation. And then from there on in, it's a negotiation of figuring out whether you could be a pilot or whether you'll be what we call a backseat driver who helps run an aircraft for the pilot, or the pilot works for the person running the tactical use of the aircraft, or whether you're going to end up maintaining aircraft or being in charge of some new program. There's always alternatives. I joined the submarine force right out of the Naval Academy. And when I joined the submarine force, I had to go through literally 18 months of training before I was trusted to go to sea on a submarine. At that point, I was the new guy and I started all over again. And another 15 months later, I had finally qualified everything that you needed to know to be a submarine officer, at least at that level. And I could start standing watch and I had more trust and responsibility. But even then, after that tour, at the end of that tour, you have some qualifications you have to finish off. And now you go to shore duty as a young officer with 6 or 7 years of service. And you have a choice. You could go back to another submarine after some shore duty and do another tour at a more senior level. Or you could say, I've seen enough of the submarine force. I want to go try ships. I want to go try aviation. And again, it's a negotiation. The assignment officer might say, well, we'll let you do that, but you got to give us 10 years of your life. Or the assignment officer might say, well, come back to us after you've served 3 more years on your second submarine, and then we'll feel like you've paid it back. Of course, if there's some part of the military that is really having trouble holding on to people, usually it's the submarine force, but it's the surface Navy as well. They'll say, oh, sure, come on over. We need the people. Come on over. That's no problem. We need you right now. When can you go to sea? And that tends to go in waves. So you may find out one year that nobody wants to talk to you about going into a different branch of the service. And then the next year, a retention didn't quite work out the way everybody hoped. And now they really do need you. You asked about what's called inter-service transfers, where you start out in one military and you want to go to a different branch, like from Navy to Air Force. That is hypothetically possible. It depends on, again, your background and your skills. For example, if you're doing work in the Navy intelligence and you want to transfer over to the Air Force version of intelligence, we could probably do that. If you want to go from the Navy submarine force to the Air Force's aviation community and fly F-16 fighters, it might not be happening the way you expect it to. So it's a very highly individual situation. Now, again, When you join the military, if you sign up with a recruiter for enlistment, you get a whole bunch of diagnostic exams, and they say, you'd be really good in these areas. And then they look at where they're very short on people, and they say, we'd really like you to consider these specific areas. Some things are optional. For example, everybody who joins the submarine force is a volunteer. If you join the Navy right out of high school, you could go to ships, you could go to aircraft, you could go to various shore communities. If you want to go to submarines, you have to volunteer for it. But we joke that when we were being considered for submarine duty, that we had to go through a psychiatric screening. And at the end of the psychiatric screening, you were told, well, yeah, you can go to submarines. You're okay. You've passed this. But we didn't really understand whether that meant that we were mentally stable and ready for submarines, or that we were psychiatric issues and problems and we might as well go to submarines. I don't know if you
That they want you away from the main core of the Navy.
You might not survive in the real Navy. We'll put you in a submarine force where it's a little safer and you have more of your own kind. But I'm sure that everybody is just checked for things like whether or not you're claustrophobic or whether or not you have any other medical or mental issues. But those are all options when you start in the military. And hypothetically, when you get to the end of the first obligation, you can change your mind and say, yeah, I want to go do something different. Again, one thing that's always available, and I tell people this over and over again, the military is one of the very few places in the world where if you want a pension, you have to vest in it at the 20-year point. Imagine if you were fresh out of college, you went to work for General Motors or Google or Procter & Gamble, and they said, we'll give you a pension, but you have to agree to stay here for 20 years. Nobody would do that. And so in the military, only 1 out of every 6 people stays around long enough for that 20 years to get the pension. Instead, what most people do is they go on active duty, they reach a point where the fun stops. They were challenged and fulfilled, they were advancing, they were getting promoted, life was good, not necessarily fun all the time, but generally happy. And all of a sudden something happens to the career and the fun is gone and the challenge and fulfillment has left. And Steve Jobs used to say, if you get up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself if you're having fun and you're not, and this goes on for a couple of years, time to find a different job. And that's exactly the way the military works. And so when you reach the end of that obligation, you probably should consider going to the reserves. And by reserves, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year of active duty. And it's a part-time military job, but it keeps your skills in there and it keeps you relatively proficient. You're with people who share your camaraderie, your values, your experiences, and it's a lot easier to go to 20 years in the reserves. My pension started when I was just over 41 years old. If you do some active duty and then move to the reserves and get to a grand total of 20 years by doing some reserve service, you vested in a pension, but it's not an active duty pension. It doesn't start until you're age 60. So my spouse retired from the reserves in 2008, and it was 14 more years before she started her pension in 2022. And all of those are different types of pensions in the military. The point is not that you get an active duty pension and get a whole bunch of money. The point is that you have a stable income, a stream of income that is inflation adjusted, and it comes with cheap health insurance. And so if you retire from the military, you've got an active duty pension and you've got cheap health care, you're probably going to reach financial independence. Now, if you have done no savings in the military whatsoever, and it happens, then you're probably going to jump into a bridge career. But if you did 20 years of active duty, maybe you're curious about what you could do outside of the military in the civilian world. And maybe you want that bridge career in addition to your pension and your cheap health care. At that point, it's up to you. My spouse and I had a high savings rate for almost all the 20 years we were in the military. And so when I retired from active duty, we knew that my pension would cover housing and groceries and transportation, and that our savings investments using the 4% safe withdrawal rate would let us be financially independent. So that worked out very well. And the fact that she was able to continue in the reserves and eventually vest in her own pension meant that we were going to win the game. When she started her pension at age 60, if our investments had troubles, well, they only had to make it until she turned 60 years old. So we knew at that point we were pretty much guaranteed financial independence for life. And it has worked out that way. Yay. But I'm watching my daughter and son-in-law right now, and she left after her 8 years. They just reached financial independence a couple of years ago. And they're at the point now where you would call it lean FI or coast FI. They're certainly building their wealth and they're continuing to invest and save. And my son-in-law has that option coming up. He'll reach the end of his service obligation in 2027. There will be a negotiation with the Navy. They will have to decide how they want to retain him because he knows he can leave if he wants. He can go to the reserves if he wants. he could be a cold turkey civilian if he wants. He's got plenty of skills, but I think he would miss the aspects of hanging out with other service members and doing Navy missions and that challenge and fulfillment that you have on active duty. Only dial it back a little, throttle it down some. Let's do it 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year instead of 24/7, 365. So he may or may not invest in a reserve pension. He doesn't know yet either, let alone me, but they're financially independent. If he isn't comfortable staying in the reserves, he'll still find a way to make money. And my daughter has also found plenty of things she enjoys doing for money. So they're fine. They'll be set for life just by the fact that they've reached that lean FI, coast FI. And unlike the 1990s version of financial independence, today everybody understands portable careers, part-time work, gig economy, freelancing. They all know they're probably going to earn another dollar here and there for the next 20 years and continue to be even more financially independent.
Yeah, that's true. It is a little bit easier today to be financially independent, and you don't have to worry about completely stopping working. And I say it that way because I'm like, well, the 1990s, you also had your high salaries and low cost of living. Well, my mom likes to rub it in my face that in Houston, granted, this was not Hawaii, but in Houston, she bought this massive 4,000 square foot house for $93,000 in, I think it was like 1994 or something like that. And she was a single mom and she was an accountant. And so you can't do that today. That doesn't exist today. You can't do that. That's what I mean. But anyway,
she's absolutely right about that part. Yeah. And the high salaries in the 1990s with the internet expansion and the World Wide Web coming up, sure, there were some high salaries there too. But if you were somebody who had been working in the 80s and you didn't leap into the computer revolution or the internet or the web, then maybe you missed out on all that. I do agree that housing has been a problem since the Great Recession. We just haven't built housing fast enough to keep up with the demographics. Now, what needs to happen is that enough of my generation needs to stop using housing for enough of the following generations to have more houses come available on the market. We're seeing the same demographics in a very bad way in Hawaii. We're aging in Hawaii as fast as Japan or Korea. We're also not building real estate fast enough. Now, there are 2 big new neighborhoods that are just beginning to open up on the island of Oahu, and it's still nowhere near enough. But it's going to be a little less ridiculous in prices and availability and how you can afford a mortgage.
Yeah, that's really fair. And I know that we could like really quickly switch topics.
I'll never get back to it. Yeah.
No, it's fine. I like it. Everywhere is a little bit different, but at least in Durham, North Carolina, where I live, it's similar. There's just not enough inventory, which is funny because when you're owning a house, that's a good thing because it makes your home that you own more valuable. So like I own my home, and even though it's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 100-year-old house, it's still really valuable because there's not a lot here. And
right.
In the Great Recession, when the housing market tanked everywhere else, North Carolina, or at least the Raleigh-Durham area, just stagnated. Home prices didn't go down. They just flattened for several years, but they didn't go down, which was really lucky. And it was because housing supply. And Raleigh is a tech hub in that it's software, but it's mostly biotech. Lots of research because of Duke University out here. And so there's a lot of housing for needs for folks who are doing that, because those are all in-person jobs because you're working in a lab and things like that. So anyway, I digress. I agree. I think we need to add more housing. And I like how Paula Pant talks about this on her show, Afford Anything. Afford Everything. She says, when you buy a home, the best thing to do is, first, if it's a home that you're going to use as an investment, split it into units instead of just renting it by itself is a great way to do it. Or if you're buying your home for yourself and say you have a detached garage, make the garage into an ADU that you can rent out. And so you're creating housing that way. That's how you can be that a little bit of that change. And I love that. So yeah, I'm with you on that. But yeah, we totally digressed. I do have one more question about the military. Can you join the military later in life, or is there an age cap?
There is a cap that's put in place by Congress. And what Congress wants the military to do is make sure that by the time somebody gets 20 years of service in the military, that they are no more than 60 or 62 years old. And so the military takes that congressional federal law and says, well, we're not going to let anybody join the military if you're older than 42 years old. However, That means that there's a whole bunch of other people who want to get in the military younger, and anything that the military needs people for, they'll start taking all the younger people they can get as fast as they can get them because they know that they'll be around longer. So the military is very reluctant to take anybody into active duty if they're in their 30s or late 30s or early 40s. But there are exceptions. One exception is if you have obscure skills like trauma surgeon, you can probably join the military later in life. If you were in one service before and you're moving to another service, you have to resign from the first service and join the second service. That might happen in your 30s, and so that's usually understood. And there are other weird skills, maybe that special purpose. For example, a friend of mine was an electrical engineer. He had done 20 years in the Marine Corps and had retired from the Marine Corps and was perfectly happy being a retired Marine until 9/11. And then as soon as 9/11, as soon as the recruiting stations opened, he was trying to rejoin the military. But what ended up happening is, as an electrical engineer who was finally needed in the Battle of Fallujah to go into the city and help the military, the Marines, destroy the electrical grid, the electrical station that was generating power there. And then after they destroyed it, when the Marines took over the town, then he had to figure out how to start it up again. So that was his special project for about a year. That's an extreme example of somebody who was allowed back into the military because of their skill set. In the reserves and in the National Guard, it is not uncommon to have people serving until they're in their late 40s, early 50s. That 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year means that as long as you're promoting, as long as you're getting billets, as long as you're challenged and fulfilled, you can continue to do it for 30 years if you achieve a high enough rank. And if you left active duty in your 20s, then you might be in the reserves or the Guard for another 20, 25 years. And it's not unusual to see once in a while a headline somewhere where a mom or dad in the Guard is welcoming their adult child into the Guard who has just enlisted or just moved over to the Guard. You see a lot of those father-daughter, mother-son, parent-child situations in the Guard. So it all depends on your skills and how long you're willing to work. It is, again, it's possible, but you've got to have a special skill set that is desperately in need of the Navy. I would highly doubt that anyone be allowed to join the submarine force beyond their late 20s, early 30s. And I say that just because of the skills that you have to learn in nuclear power and nuclear engineering and the tactical skills you have to learn with shooting weapons, torpedoes, missiles, and that. That takes some time. It takes a while to get the experience. And if you're not in an obscure skill set like deep sea, high pressure diving, the submarine force probably would rather have younger people joining.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Thanks. I just wondered, I'm 37 and I'm not going to join the military, but I was just thinking if there were other people who were in their early 30s, late 30s, who were like, man, I'm listening to this military career and it sounds so cool. This guy lives in Hawaii. I want to live in Hawaii. And is it too late for me? And it's not if you're a trauma surgeon, so go for it.
I tell people it looks really good now. There's an element of survivor bias here, but it doesn't reflect all the struggles and all the other stuff we went through to get here.
Yeah, yep, that's very true. Cool. Okay, so we touched on your background a little bit. We went back to the 1990s, but I want to go back a little further than that to get a sense of your money story. And one question I love asking my guests is, if you remember, what is one of your earliest money memories?
I thought about that. And really, the earliest one I could think of was when I was about 7, 8 years old. I had a wallet that had $8 in it, and I'd probably saved up that $8 over the course of a year or two. I don't really remember much about money or spending habits or anything in those early years. As a teenager, I was all about earning more money. But there was probably something psychiatric going on there with the security of having more money. But again, that was just something that back in the 70s, you did a job to get some money to be able to afford to do stuff. And if you had leftover money, you were supposed to save that for college because nobody was going to pay for your college. And that was pretty much my only motivation at the time, was to earn that money for a little bit of freedom. As a teenager in the 1970s, way before the web, your ultimate freedom came from a driver's license. So, of course, you needed to be able to afford gas. And that was where the money story that I grew up with was mostly saving. You could even call it borderline hoarding of money, but definitely collecting it.
Yeah, that's a great one. And where were your parents financially, would you say? Were they middle class?
Today, in retrospect, 40 years later, I've begun to realize that they were probably about upper middle class. My father was an electrical engineer with Westinghouse Nuclear, so he had an electrical engineering degree, and he knew enough about nuclear reactors and how they made electricity to be able to help people figure out if they wanted to buy one for their city, their utility. And that was a sales job, so he was probably reasonably well paid for that. My mother was a registered nurse. Now, a registered nurse back in 50s and 60s and the 70s was far different than it is today, far less technical, far more caregiving. But again, she still had skills. I remember when we were teenagers, she started going back to work part-time because registered nurses still, well, if you were cool under pressure and had some skills with patient care, then you could get back into the workforce whenever you wanted as a registered nurse. What was not discussed was money. That was rude, impolite, not culturally acceptable. This was a small town outside of Pittsburgh in the 1960s and 70s. And I didn't grow up with a real understanding of a reasonable income or what it would take to survive once I was launched from the nest. I had no idea about budgeting. I knew how to earn money. I knew how to save it, but I really didn't have much strength with budgeting or spending it in a mindful manner. Eventually, like everybody else in college, I hit rock bottom and was tired of that lifestyle. And that's about when I started budgeting and learned to save and budget. And that way I had money left over. But that really didn't happen until college. I really never knew anything about my parents' finances until I personally was in my 50s, taking care of my father as he reached the end of his life with Alzheimer's. And that's when I ended up taking over his finances. And that's when I got a better perspective on what their earnings had been, what their lifestyle was like, just from having to take over that part.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Generationally speaking, that was probably pretty typical back then, right? And I'm very sorry to hear about your father getting Alzheimer's. That's tough. I have a family member who is going through something like that, and it's really tough. So I'm sorry to hear about that. Do you remember any? I know that they didn't like necessarily talk to you about, okay, save 10% to spend the rest. Didn't really give you those kind of skills. But do you remember any conversations that they had where you were like just in the room and they were having it with each other, like maybe around paying bills or how much to spend on groceries or buying a new car or buying a house or anything like that?
I really don't. We're not going to be stressed in front of the kids, I guess, is the parental attitude. And we're fine, boys. We have enough money, that kind of thing. But what I do remember is that there was a tense conversation one day when I was, I guess, a junior in high school, that so-and-so had been let go from Westinghouse Nuclear, and it looked like the industry was going to go through some tough times. And this was 1976, 1977, so still before 3 Mile Island, but many of the nuclear power plants in the 50s and 60s were aging badly, and I'm sure that there were problems selling new, expensive power plants with nuclear reactors in them. And just as I started my end of my junior year, just as I started my senior year of high school, my father, it's not clear to me, I think he quit before he got laid off, but I remember he came home and said he quit his job. And of course, the financial version of that was, I'm fine, boys, we'll be all right. And that's all the detail I got. But I remember that for the next 9 months until he figured out where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do, and this was with my mother's discussion as well, of course, he was quite a happy guy. He was home all day. He was doing his own thing. The house got fixed up. The yard got fixed up. All those chores that had been sitting around waiting for him to come home from a business trip. He probably was taking daily naps, I'm guessing, because that's what I did when I retired. But he was a really happy guy, and eventually he figured it out. It was one of those situations where he didn't really know where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do, but he thought his spouse was going to want certain things. And she didn't really know what she wanted to do or where she wanted to go, but she thought that he would want certain things. And these mistaken assumptions went on for about 6 months until the two of them had a mutual moment where they were looking at each other and saying, wait, what? And the upshot was that they left Pittsburgh in 1978 and moved to Denver, Colorado, and lived over there for the rest of their lives. And that was right as I joined the Naval Academy. So right as I was launching from the nest, they were moving to Colorado.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, I'm very curious about this. So it sounds like your dad for about 9 months was unemployed and absolutely tickled about it, which is hilarious because sometimes like when people are unemployed, they're very anxious. So it just goes to show you that if you've got your ducks in a row and you can take a break and it's fine. But what were those expectations that your parents had of each other that they weren't quite communicating?
They were entertaining job offers. And he had grown up in Cincinnati. She had grown up in Pittsburgh. We were living near Pittsburgh in a suburb of Pittsburgh, and life was good. And then when he started the job search as an electrical engineer with kind of a nerdy nuclear reactor reputation, you pretty much get a lot of offers. Again, I'm guessing 40 years later, but I'm pretty sure he was getting job offers. And all the offers that he got in the Pittsburgh area, he wasn't very happy with, and he wasn't sure that was going to work, but he thought that my mother would want to live in Pittsburgh. He did get an offer in a company in Denver, and he turned it down because he thought that there was no way she wanted to move to Denver. My mother didn't particularly care for Pittsburgh, a lot of bad memories growing up. She would not have minded moving, but that discussion, for whatever reason, didn't happen between the two of them at the time. And eventually, when she saw him talking about that offer in Denver and turning it down, she thought he just hated Denver. And this probably persisted for another couple of months until you reach that point in the job search where the new offers have slowed to a trickle and you start going back through your contact list and looking at the old offers and wondering if things have changed and if you should go back and try a second round with those people. And that's when they had the conversation about, what? I thought you didn't want to move to Denver. Well, I thought you wanted to stay in Pittsburgh. And today it's funny, right? And I'm sure you've had the same conversations in your life. And we certainly have had those share in my marriage, where it took us a while to realize exactly that we really were on the same card or that we did have different ideas. They sorted it out. They figured it out. And he ended up working in a completely different job in Denver. It was something to do with solar energy. But he knew all the electrical engineering stuff he needed to know for that job already, and that worked out very well. He joked at that point that he'd gone back to work part-time for 40 hours a week. And what that really meant was that they were, in today's words, lean FI. And because they were lean FI, he was able to be relatively picky about work-life balance and do what he wanted to do in the manner he wanted to do it. And later on in life, my mother passed away in her late 40s, breast cancer, and he was a widower for the rest of his life. And in those years of his life, he was very much the kind of guy who would drive around the Rockies hiking, fishing, and camping. And that's pretty inexpensive. And he didn't spend a lot of money at that. And meanwhile, all the investments were compounding. He had enough money already to be lean FI. And of course, Coast FI took over from there. When I ended up eventually taking over his finances, he was in his 70s by that point. And he was living well within his Social Security. I mean, he had a pension income, he had some interest and dividend income, but he was really living, and he was still banking money from his Social Security. He was doing, it wasn't that he was no-go, it was just that he was doing the things he loved. He had his lifestyle dialed in the way he wanted, and he didn't need a lot of money to live that kind of lifestyle, so he didn't worry about it, and he just let everything compound and run away. So from that perspective, being financially independent when he reached that period in the 70s or 80s, and then for the rest of his life, that worked out very well. And what my first book that I wrote about military financial independence, I dedicated to him because at some point you get to a stage of your military career where you're not sure what you're going to do when you get out. You're not even sure you want to get out, let alone whether you can get a job. We're taught in the military that we're barely capable of holding on to our current job and our current rank without getting disqualified or fired, let alone promoting and getting better deals. We call that the military inferiority complex. And I was going through that phase at about 15 years of service, and I was wondering what I was going to do after the military. And my father happened to be visiting then. He'd been retired himself by that point for about 20 years. And as we were driving along, I was griping about all the skills assessments and interest surveys and all the other things you could do back then, mostly through workbooks, to figure out what you were going to be after you left the military. And also, all I'd figured out so far was that I'd be a good nuclear engineer or a middle-level manager, and neither one of those appealed to me, and they certainly didn't appeal to him either. There's a TV show that's off the air now. It's called That 70s Show. And there's a character in there called Red Foreman and his son, the teenager, Christopher. And that was a relationship my father and I had. And at some point I said that I didn't know what I was going to do after the military. And he looked over at me and he said, "You've been in the Navy for a while. Have you managed to save any money?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, we have. We have quite a bit of money, and we're doing very well." And he gave me that look that Red Foreman would give to his son. That's where Red Foreman would say, "You dumbass." And that's pretty much the look my father gave me. And he said, "Why would anybody want to work if you have enough money to live the life you want to live?" And that's when I realized that if I retired from active duty, then I would be able to make my own finances work for a life of financial independence. And we'd be stable, we'd be sustainable, it'd probably all work. We figured out how as we went, but I didn't need to worry about finding another job. And that was the first time I had the self-confidence to understand it was all going to work.
Yeah, it's really interesting to know because one of my questions as you were talking was building that it seems like your dad reached financial independence, even though fire was not that it wasn't a thing, but it wasn't like a movement or a community or like a phrase back then. But he had reached it, and he reached it in a way that sounds very familiar. Living in Colorado, hiking, being outdoorsy, living within your means.
Uh-huh.
Who do we know who does that, who lives out there and has a
I
blog?
don't think he'd even been born yet.
Yeah, he probably has it. Mr. Money Mustache is who we're referring to, by the way, y'all. And it made me think, okay, but wait, you had already shipped off and had your own life. Like, you weren't a kid anymore. So all of this was not necessarily influencing you. And so it made me wonder, okay, so how did you get on this path? But here we are. This is how, like, you guys had this conversation. Was it just the one conversation and you were like, oh, duh, and it just clicked? Or did it take a little bit
yes.
more?
Specifically, it was 6 months after our daughter was born. He was visiting us in Hawaii, and we had that conversation in 1993. A few months later, a new book showed up at the library, Your Money or Your Life. And I read that book, and suddenly it all made sense. There's a chart in there that shows that you're growing your assets, and eventually your assets are throwing enough income to pay your expenses, the other line on the chart. And where those two lines cross, you're financially independent. And that was the life-changing epiphany right there, was that book. A few years later, the Millionaire Next Door book came out, which just reinforced everything we already knew. They had you look at things like, how much money have you earned in your life, and how much do you have in assets today? In other words, where did all the money go? And we were pretty good on that ratio. And there's also some research that had come out. Now, again, today this looks like conventional wisdom, but at the time in the 90s, this was bleeding edge, maybe even wacko research. But one of them was Bill Bengen coming up with the SafeMax study for what became the 4% safe withdrawal rate. And then in 1998, a bunch of professors at Trinity University came up with the Trinity study that took Bill Bengen's SafeMax study and expanded on it for different asset allocations. And all those things happening in the 90s, started, my dad planted the seed, and that's where it grew from there, was through those books and those studies, realizing that if we got to 25 times our annual spending, then our assets would sustain us for at least 30 years on a safe withdrawal rate. I can do math. And I knew that if I retired from active duty in my 40s and only had 20 years to Social Security, and I had the 4% safe withdrawal rate, that we were probably going to be all right. And that's the way it worked out. But it was all that conversation about, what am I going to do after the military? It was about all those conversations during the military of, let's save and invest, because we never know when we're going to have enough and want to get out of the military. And we need to have that transition fund saved up so that we can find a job and start a new career. Well, I ended up staying for 20. In retrospect, I way overshot the mark. But again, I didn't see it all growing that way. By the assumptions of the day, it was just enough, and it worked out just fine. But since then, we've dialed in our lifestyle, and the compounding has just run away and done its thing over the years.
Yeah. My question is, a lot of people would have that conversation with their dad. They would see these studies and they'd see these books, and they might still not make the decision to go down that path because lifestyle creep. What are their friends and their neighbors doing? But I really want the new car, and I really want the big house, and I really want to spend all the money that I have, because you only have today. What set you up to have the mindset to be receptive to that, do you think? Like, when you think about it now, why do you think you became the kind of person who could receive that and actually take action on it?
One part of it is that we'd been in the military. I tell military families, when you're saving for financial independence, you're going to do it in a manner that's frugal. You're going to feel challenged and fulfilled. It feels like you're winning because you're paying off your debt. You're starting to save. You're starting to invest. You can watch all that compounding go on. Frugality means living below your means, but you're still enjoying it and it's still sustainable. And then I joke that every military family knows where the line is drawn and where it becomes deprivation. We've all been there, and some military families have been there for months and even years. And it's because somebody's deployed, or somebody's gotten injured and there's rehab, or the career didn't go the way we thought, or somebody had to go and do overseas duty without their spouse, without their family. Whatever it is, it's deprivation. It might be an awesome way to save money because you're not spending any money because you're working too hard. But on the other hand, it's not sustainable. It's just something that works for a short time to pay off debt. And we had gone through that, and we had gotten to the point in our careers where we knew that the military had been enough, and we really didn't think we had anything we wanted to do on the outside. Now, of course, we still looked. But you're absolutely right. As soon as I got to the 17, 18, 19-year point, and we looked at our finances, we realized one day that our compounding, not just interest and dividends, but our net worth had risen by more than both of us had earned together that year. In other words, our investments doing nothing had done more for our net worth than my spouse and I working 50, 60, 70-hour weeks and parenting in our spare time and fixing up the home we had bought and making it better with home improvement projects, things like that. So that's when you begin to realize that maybe this really is sustainable if the growth in your investments is going to pay for your living expenses. And we'd also gone through more of those surveys, and essentially, even today, it's not culturally acceptable to walk into work one day and say, I'm financially independent, I'm done working, and I quit, right? You're going to be so bored. You're too young. You don't know what you're missing. You have so much potential ahead of you. You really could have made something of yourself. What about next year's sales goals? You're letting down the team. You won't be here to help us get through all these things anymore. You're just going to be crawling back to work here in 6 months because you want something to do and you run out of money and you're going to be humbled and you're going to have to work for only 2/3 of your salary. Or we're going to find you being a greeter at Walmart. And it's words like that. The one I happened to get told was, well, what are you going to do? You're going to surf all day? This is Hawaii, so that's possible. And it became socially acceptable to say, well, we have enough money for a while. I'm going to take a few months off. I'm going to spend more time with family, and then I'm going to step back and think about what I want to do with the rest of my life. But the answer was my daughter saw a sign on a fence advertising cheap surfing lessons at a beach near a military base. And just by coincidence, on the day that I retired, we took surfing lessons at White Plains Beach on Oahu. And all three of us, my wife, myself, and our daughter, and we all managed to stand up. Our daughter did a lot faster than her parents did. But at the end of it, I was hooked. My daughter was hooked. My spouse is still, take it or leave it. She likes kayaking, but she doesn't go surfing 3 times a week like I do. And it turned out you can surf all day. And it's just a lifestyle. And now in real life nowadays, in my 60s, I surf 2-3 times a week. But I'm still fixing up a board or looking at other boards or deciding which board I want to take out for which conditions and where I want to go. There's always something different to do in the water. You're not competing with anybody but yourself, but you're always trying to do something at the next level, a little bit better, a little more challenging, different conditions. The ocean is different every day. It never gets boring. So I turned out to have found the answer from that joke, are you going to surf all day? And the answer is, yeah, pretty much.
I will surf all day. Watch me.
And I think people began to realize that. And we did get job offers and we considered them. And in general, we know we could go back to work if we wanted to. The dissatisfiers are worse than the satisfiers. There's not enough good stuff about the job to outweigh the fact that if you're required to show up, you're going to have to deal with rush hours, workplace uniforms, mandatory training, maybe even a sense of competitiveness kicks in and you start trying to climb the ladder for no good reason. And so we had all those discussions. We had opportunities and we thought through them and decided, yeah, we're not going to do that. But it's been 22 years. And now that I'm in my 60s, I no longer get that, oh, you're too young to retire. They don't give me that, oh, you don't look old enough to retire, those kinds of comments. Instead, I get questions like, wow, 22 years, tell me more. And that's when the real discussion about financial independence begins.
All right, that's it for part 1 with Doug. Tune in next time. We're going to go deeper into his financial independence story. You don't want to miss it. That episode is coming out next week. So I'll see you then. Thanks for listening to the EverydayFI podcast. If you're loving the show, here are some things you can do. Number 1, subscribe in your favorite podcast player and share the show with your friends and family. Number 2, please leave a review. I'm always looking for ways to improve the show. Number 3, check out my website, EverydayFI.com, where you can listen to all the episodes and leave comments for myself and the guest. Number 4, if you're interested in sharing your own financial independence story, you can find a submission form at EverydayFI.com/podcast. And finally, number 5, join my Patreon membership for only $5 a month at patreon.com/EverydayFI podcast. This is a one-woman show, so every little bit counts. See you next time as we continue to go down the path to financial freedom.